I'm very tempted to say George Schultz needs no introduction, so I don't provide one. But it's very hard for me to do that because he's been such a large influence on me as a friend, as a colleague, as a mentor, and as a role model. And for those of you who have not had the opportunity to spend time with him or observe him lately, he's probably in the top 1% of most productive scholars at Hoover and Stanford today. He churns out a book every 6 or 12 months. And he's extremely active in a wide range of areas, intellectually and policy-wise, that span his interests, which are well represented by his portfolio in public service, being director of OMB, being Treasury Secretary, Labor Secretary, Treasury Secretary, and Secretary of State. And George has always said that he likes to help put ideas into action. And I can think of no better public servant than George Schultz to, as an example of that, in his first, he might want to mention it, but he's as productive as most 40-year-olds, but in his first X years, and I'm sure that will be the case for his second X years, because he shows absolutely no sign whatsoever of slowing down. One of his areas of interest has been North America. It was a big interest of his as Secretary of State. If you've read his book, he had raised this thing about your own neighborhood and so on. And he's written a very influential piece in the Wall Street Journal about North America. And so I can't think of somebody any better to, essentially for the nature of this conference, being thinkers and policymakers together to talk about NAFTA and its consequences and its opportunities and its future than George Schultz. So I'll turn it over to George.
Thank you, Michael. This has been a fascinating morning. I think NAFTA is really a huge achievement, big time implications, and lots ahead. And I can't thank the people who negotiated it enough for what they did. It was hard and difficult, but done with a great deal of skill. And I'm sure enthusiasm. You can't work that hard unless you're enthusiastic about what you're doing. And I'll tell you one thing, Carl, I would never want to negotiate versus you.
I agree.
Did she propose to you, or was it the other way around? Yeah, okay. Well, what I would like to do is three things. Number one, talk a little bit about the history as I experienced it and saw it. No involvement in the NAFTA process as such, but on all around it. And second, some of the immediate results that we see. And then what about what's ahead? What are the things we need to look for and do as we go forward? And I might say I have been very interested. We've had our 9th meeting now of something called the North America Forum. And the last meeting was in Mexico City. And this has been a kind of pulling together of people and ideas, and it has struck me how, as we've gone through this process, how there has been a kind of coalescence. And North America, at least in these terms, has begun to emerge more and more. Well, first of all, the history. I remember back when I was Secretary of Treasury, the international monetary system was in turmoil. The finance minister of Canada at the time was John Turner, and he and I became friends and worked together. And we sort of wanted to be North America, and we couldn't find anybody, or it was just, Mexico was not in the game. Then I come back later with President Reagan. I had gotten to know President Reagan quite well. I was his economic advisor during the primaries and during the campaign and for the first part of his presidency before I was Secretary of State. He was a Hoover honorary fellow, and he was here. We had a wonderful dinner once at my house. I think you were there, Michael. with him. But at any rate, I got so I had a good conversationally kind of, and he was a visionary type guy, and he had his views about a lot of things. One of them was he had a vision of North America. He thought somehow or other this was something that should be in our future. At the time, we had a very strong relationship with Canada and eventually negotiated the Canada Free Trade Agreement. In Reagan's view, it was clearly a prelude, as he would have thought it. But in the meantime, I felt, and he felt, foreign policy starts in your neighborhood. Yes, there's the Cold War, there's China, there's Beirut, there's the Middle East, and so on. But nevertheless, where you live is very important. So I deliberately made my first trip out of the country as Secretary of State to Canada and the second one to Mexico, just to make that point. I must say the press was mystified. And they were totally uninformed about the nature of our relationships. It was surprising to me. At any rate, that sort of was continued on, and I dealt with President de la Madrid. And to my way of thinking, looking at this history, he's something of the unsung hero of a lot of what's happened. So I remember him telling me, he said, you can't believe what the government of Mexico owns. Every time somebody goes bankrupt, the government takes it over. He said, we own beauty parlors, we own shopping malls, we own all this stuff. What are we doing? And we got to get out of this nonsense. And then it was de la Madrid that put Mexico into GATT. It was a big step in 1986, I believe. So I thought de la Madrid did a lot. And then, of course, then came Salinas and Pedro Aspe and Jaime and so on. And it was a different crew who had a different outlook. And we got NAFTA. And as I said, I think it was a huge, huge event. Well, I think there has emerged out of this a sense that there is such a thing as North America. There is kind of a regional organization here that's arrived without people understanding that it's happened, but it's there. The trade is gigantic. We are each other's largest trading partners. And the interesting thing to me about the trade is how interconnected it is. 40% of the U.S. imports from Mexico are U.S. origin. Think of that. It's 25% from Canada. With China, by contrast, it's 4%. So there is a kind of integration here. It isn't just trade. It's a back and forth that's so real. There are something like 230 million people a year, Canadians, US, Mexicans, wander around in each other's countries legally. That's a lot of movement of people. The most cross-border in the world legally is the US-Mexican border. Actually, we were talking about the truck problem. There are a lot of trucks cross the border, huge numbers and more. And there are problems, but it isn't as though nothing's happening. So you have all of these things. Since NAFTA, each of the 3 countries has negotiated free trade agreements with other countries. The number of countries that adds up to now is about 50. Mexico has a free trade agreement with Europe. Canada, I guess, about has one by now. And we're at least getting going on one. But at any rate, what this does in a kind of subtle way is expand the scope of NAFTA beyond the confines. But NAFTA and North America is kind of a base from which this is happening. So it's a big deal. So my contention is, and my hope is, and my belief is that it can develop and continue if we do it right. So what are the problems ahead that we need to pay attention to and the opportunities? First of all, Mexico is changing. I circulated some charts, and they show you that fertility in Mexico has dropped very, very sharply. And you see now it is below replacement level. What does that mean? That means that the huge numbers of young Mexicans that used to come across our border aren't there anymore, or are diminishing in supply greatly. Combine that, particularly if the energy initiative goes forward, with the improving health of the Mexican economy. And we don't have an immigration problem from Mexico anymore. Actually, the net immigration of Mexicans to the US last year was 0. I think there were more US went to Mexico than the other way around. So it's a totally different situation. I think it follows to me, in our immigration debate, we're worrying about the wrong border. We should want to turn the US-Mexico border into something like what we have with Canada, which, while it has a little more stresses than before 9/11, I think it has been worked on, and it works pretty well. You can't get by with a driver's license anymore, but a passport will do. That's not so onerous. But we should do the same thing with Mexico, and have a situation where people from any of the 3 countries can be in the other country, live there, not a big deal. The Canadian Council here in San Francisco tells me, and I've tried to verify this figure, it's very big, I'm staggered by it, but it's her job to watch. She says there are 1 million Canadians living in California. But no, so what? It's not an issue at all, at all. And I think if we can create a situation where people move to where they are productive and fruitful and have jobs and find life good, why not? It's something that we should achieve. And I think the facts underlying the demographic situation give that opportunity a chance. Now, but does that mean there's no problem on the Mexican border? There is. And what we need to do, and I know that Mexico is quietly working on this, I've looked into this, but if Mexico would like some help from US and Canada, we should be ready to give it. Our problem is the southern border of North America, Mexico's southern border. And we want to help Mexico avoid becoming a transit country with all of the corruption and human degradation that goes with human trafficking. I think a lot of effort should be put on that. That's where the immigration issue needs to be. So, number one, in terms of people looking out ahead, it seems to me there is an opportunity, just born out of the demographics, if nothing else, to rearrange our thinking about immigration around in North America and put our efforts where they're needed. So that's number one. Number two, to the extent we think of ourselves as having a labor force, a North America labor force, the evidence is very clear. Despite what I heard on the Wall Street Journal editorial report that education doesn't matter. That's the matter with Bret Stephens anyway. There is absolute evidence that the quality of your labor force and the rate of growth of your GDP just goes right together. Yes, there are other factors. It's not the only factor, but it's a very strong factor. And I know in California, our education system is crummy. 43% of the Latinos in California, which are our largest ethnic group now, don't finish high school. Only about 12% finish college. That's our future labor force. They're not going to be able to do the jobs that are being produced by the hotshots around here. So we're failing. You talk about the problems of the distribution of income. That's where it starts. So in the United States, we really have to work on the K through 12 education, and Canada does a really good job in this respect. Maybe you've got something to teach us. And Mexico is worse than the US. So Mexico has a lot of work to do in this respect, I think. Very important to do. And it was, as I at least interpret it, the first thing the new president did was throw the head of the teachers union in jail for very justified reasons. It wasn't like there weren't good reasons. And there have been these riots in Mexico City, but it just ended when I got there the last time. But the government has stood up to them. And so that's very encouraging, that there is going to be a serious effort to tackle the K through 12 education issues. And I think there is a lot of movement in the United States. As in Mexico, in the United States, at least as I see it, the big problem is the teachers union. And since they control the Democrats, that's our biggest problem. But at any rate, we're getting there. Choice is developing more and more. And I hope the future will be better in K through 12 education, but I think that is a big issue for us to face. The third issue is drugs. And here, the culprit is the United States. Our big demand for illicit drugs and the criminalization of every aspect of it creates a margin, the biggest margin of any industry in the world. So it's a hugely profitable industry. And the industry, by definition, is criminal. And the money winds up going south of our border to Mexico, Central America, and corrupts and makes the process of government hard. Because often the drug gangs have got more money, more access to arms, which they buy in the United States, incidentally, than the local government does. And so we've seen huge numbers of murders. Who knows? 50,000, I see, estimated in the last 5 or 6 years. But it's a huge problem. And it also results, to a certain extent, in growing addiction in the countries that are sending, because the people who have this profitable business want to develop a business, so they try to get kids hooked and turn them into mules and so on. It's a really bad situation. Really bad. It's interesting that in Prohibition, we went from having an amendment prohibiting alcohol. In 11 years, by a constitutional amendment, we stopped. And probably there are a lot of reasons why we were so quick there. And we've been 40 years of war on drugs. One of them was that the violence was here. You remember Al Capone, you remember St. Valentine's Massacre, and so on. We have outsourced the violence, you might say, in the case of drugs, although it will come here more. But at any rate, this is something that we need to get after, and I don't think it's so mysterious, conceptually anyway, to know how to do it. I've sort of backed off of the idea of legalization. It's too much for people. But I think decriminalization of the taking of drugs and small-scale production could make a huge change. Because if you do that, it's possible for somebody to go to a treatment center without the risk of going to jail. Our jails are full of young kids, heavily minority. Why are they there? They got caught taking drugs and having a little few drugs. And what do they do in jail? They learn how to be real criminals. It's a vicious cycle. If those kids instead went to treatment centers, well, the evidence that we have from what goes on in Portugal is that you don't get very far with the older addicts. But with young people, you can make a dent. And that's worth doing. But in the process, you take a lot of the money out of the system from the standpoint of the criminals. And we can begin to see a better situation in our neighborhood. So I think the drug problem, and it's a U.S. problem, has imposed tremendous problems on our neighbors, particularly to the south. And we should do something about it. I have a history on this. When I left the job of Secretary of State, I came back here to Stanford, and I made a talk at a Stanford alumni thing of some kind, and I expressed some of my views, and somebody must have been there with a recorder anyway. The next Monday it wound up in the Wall Street Journal. My God, I was inundated. I've never had so much mail about anything. 90% of the people who wrote said they agreed with me, and about 99% of them said they would never say anything like that because they'd be afraid of being ostracized. But since that time, things have gradually loosened up. So, a global group working on this, and it's not an accident that the co-chairs are three former presidents of Latin American countries, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia. So we have an incipient rebellion to our south if we're not careful as we look at this issue. And there are ways of addressing it if we can get around to them. Ways that would be much better for people who are taking drugs and much better for the society. People say, oh, you have to invest in treatment centers. Yes, of course, we should. But that's nothing compared with the huge sums of money that are being poured out in the criminalization effort. So that's number 3. Now, number 4 is the problem of governance. I mean, here we have an emerging big region. I might say the amount of trade is these 3 countries together had some numbers here. Well, I think it's about $1.7 trillion if you add all our exports and imports together. It's huge. The GDP of the 3 countries makes it a quarter of the world GDP. It's heavily U.S., but nevertheless. So we're talking about a large, large part of the world economy here. So how do we govern it? How do we make it go? Well, I have a project on my mind that I'm working on. And I'm saying to myself as I look around that the great governing issue of our times on a global basis is how you govern over diversity in an age of transparency. Diversity is everywhere, but it's been possible to ignore it or suppress it. You can't do that anymore because of the depth of the information and communication age. People everywhere know what's going on. They all have cell phones. They can all communicate with each other. They can organize. That hasn't been true before, but it's true now. Look at the Ukraine right now. The head guy in the Ukraine makes this corrupt deal with Putin. Everybody knows it. And they know it's a crummy deal for them. And he's having a hard time. He may not make it. I hope he doesn't. But at any rate, you see this everywhere. It isn't only the Arab Spring. Brazil, Turkey, Sweden. Sweden protests. I saw a friend of mine from Sweden the other day. And I said, come on, Sweden? And she said, well, it wasn't among us Swedes. We have all these immigrants that have come into our country. That's what I said, All these years you've been governing over homogeneity. Now you have diversity on your hands. And you haven't thought about it, how you're going to handle the diversity. Somehow the idea of governing over diversity, I think, is going to mean more, in a sense, decentralization. More ability to sort of let diverse elements express themselves, if you can keep it within some sort of common framework. And in a way, this is the magic of North America. It has just happened. With NAFTA as the key, nevertheless, beyond that, nobody's bossing anybody around. Look, compare it with Europe. In Europe, you have a national government, but a big chunk of your sovereignty has been given away to Brussels. Another big chunk of your sovereignty has been given to Frankfurt. No wonder they're having trouble. In the case of NAFTA, this has arrived, and with the exception of the trade agreement, of course, nobody's sovereignty has been affected at all. You run your country the way you want to run your country. Why not? And I think it's very important as we project NAFTA forward to keep it that way. Resist the temptation to say, oh, well, now we're going somewhere, let's create something or other that's going to run this or that or the other thing. Obviously, you have to have agreements on certain things, on immigration and the border and whatnot. But that's not trying to run things by anybody. So I think that's a cautionary tale. It's interesting to look at the history of the United States in this regard, because our founding fathers understood that they had 13 very different states on their hands. And if they didn't recognize that in the Constitution, they'd never get it ratified. So they designed a form of government that had never existed before. They projected a federal government with limited powers. Those powers, and they constructed limited powers of the federal government, and practically everything that affects your daily life was left in the hands of the states, the localities, and individuals, a very individualistic society. And in the federal government, the powers were checked and balanced among legislative, executive, and judicial. But within the legislative branch, they designed two very different bodies. The House of Representatives was designed as a plebiscite body. Population was represented in numbers, and it operates by majority vote. It was kind of a plebiscite. That's why I thought of it. The Senate was totally different in conception. Each state had 2 senators. That meant small states were represented as strongly as big states. So big states couldn't push them around. And it's written into the Constitution on several things like treaty ratification. You got to have a 2/3 vote. And the convention in early days was anything important took place on a 2/3 vote. Why? Because they wanted to encourage discussion and back and forth and come to an agreement. That is why the Senate was described in earlier days as the greatest deliberative body in the world. Now we have junked that. So it's just going to be another plebiscite body. It's a big change. And it's also true that the federal government has gradually moved into the state and local areas in a big way. In a way, it's kind of breathtaking in the new health law that the federal government tells me, a 25-year-old kid, that I have to buy something that I don't want to buy. Wow. What would our framers have thought of that? So I think we have some thinking to do. Actually, I think we're going to have a rebellion among young people one of these days because they're more and more saying the system is rigged by older people to favor them and not us. That's just one example, but you can go through and think of tons of examples of where it looks as though the system is rigged against young people. Climate change. I'm 93 years old, who cares? But I have 4 great-grandchildren. I look at these little kids. The oldest is a little over 3, and the others are around 1 or so. They're so full of energy. They're so excited. Life is so full. They're so curious about everything. When they learn something, they look and smile, wonder if you understood they just learned this. And that world is, and I think to myself, what kind of a world are they going to inherit? And what can I do to make it a little bit better? People say the climate isn't changing. Are you kidding? But we're probably not going to feel it much, but 40 or 50 years from now, man, it's going to change things. So I think, to go back to North America, I think the fact that it has emerged in its own terms, and it's kind of a natural reaction to the opportunities that are put there, is the right way to govern it. And to have things about the borders and things about this and things about that. But the minute somebody decides we ought to have some overall framework, no. Stay away from that. And let the diversity express itself as it's doing. And we will have a North America that really works well. And I think you people who put it together ought to be really, have a right to be a little bit proud of yourselves, because you have created something, as Stephen says, that goes far beyond trade things. Not that the trade isn't important. But it's created something different and very good, positive, that can be good for people in all of the countries. The end.
Thank you.
Sure.
So George would be happy to take a few questions if anybody I have a couple, but I'll withhold mine for anybody else. Don't be bashful. He loves answering questions. Yeah, Caroline.
You mentioned the drug trade and the changes there. I was just curious about your views on the other side of the drug trade, which is the guns trade.
Well, it's part and parcel, and practically all the guns that the drug lords use are bought in the United States, which is another problem. But the basic problem is that by the criminalization and all, we've created this spread. Any business that would have a spread like this, it's hugely profitable, and it's all criminalized. So they buy guns, they buy whatever they want. And they say to local officials, so I'm told, what do you want, lead or silver? A bribe or a bullet? And they get their way. So it's a very unholy problem that's been created. I always thought, way back 40 years ago this started, and I was director of the budget. My friend Pat Moynihan was, before he was senator, he was in the White House, and he was a kind of a self-appointed drug czar. And he had the idea that the way to curtail drug use in this country was to keep drugs out of the country. And so that's what he was busy doing. the two of us are riding up to Camp David. I've got a presentation to make, so I'm busy studying, getting ready. And he's in a state of exuberance. So that Irishman in a state of exuberance is something else. So he's waving his arms. Hey, Schultz, don't you realize we just had the biggest drug bust in history? I said, great work. Back to my notes. Come on, you know, this was in Marseille. We've broken the French connection. That was the problem of the day. He said, that's great, Pat. He was very frustrated. Little pause. And he said, Schultz, I suppose you think that as long as there is a large profitable demand for drugs in this country, there will be a supply. I said to him, Moynihan, there's hope for you. That's been the case. There's no problem. I mean, drugs are plentiful in this country. And our use of drugs in this country is on the high side compared with peers. So we aren't being successful in curbing the use of drugs because we don't try to treat them in any sensible way. We just say, you're a criminal if you take them, and that's that. That's not enough.
Let me come back to demography. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mary. Go ahead. No, go ahead, please.
On that subject, maybe I shouldn't say this since there's so many people in here who have worked in Washington, but it seems to me like the likelihood of getting change on this issue out of Washington is very low just because of incentives, interests, and so forth. Do you think that what we're seeing right now, which is more of a grassroots interest in changing that's coming from states just with marijuana, but I mean, do you think that might be another way that we could get at the problem that will end up being more effective than trying to get Washington to lead on it?
Well, that's where the only action is in states. I'm antsy about what's going on in the states because these votes on marijuana are kind of votes that more or less are saying, well, marijuana's okay. And I don't think it's okay. So I'd like to see anything that's done, decriminalize marijuana, fine, but couple it somehow with a health initiative. So we're saying at the same time, let's pay attention to getting people not to take these drugs and work at it that way, just as we try and get people not to get drunk. And I think driving under the influence should absolutely apply to anybody having drugs, for example. So yeah, I think probably, Mary, the reality is you look at what's happening, that's where people are doing something. And at least at this point, the federal government is laying off. When California started, there were threats to preempt, that you couldn't do this. But they're laying off right now.
Ask a broader question, George. This question of North America, I'm part of the North American Forum, as you know, and we have good discussions there, but the sense that I've had is that in Washington, whether it's too much on their plate right now or whatever, that the desire to look at the region as a North American region does not have any real support. I guess the question is, would you agree with that? And if you do, what can be done to get the United States to broaden this perspective? I have the sense, and Jaime may want to comment on this, but I raised this whole question of North American, a North American region at the Trilateral about 1.5 years ago. And I got a very good response from the Mexicans who were there. The Americans who were there said, don't push that one.
I don't think it's opposition. I think it's just that people haven't been paying attention. And one of the objects of this North America Forum is to help bring that about. I think you've been at practically all the meetings, Carla. Maybe you would agree with that, but we keep building some momentum. The last meeting we had in Mexico City, we had a terrific turnout of the Mexican government that came and talked to us. And Canada was well represented. Unfortunately, it came during the government shutdown, so we had one Assistant Secretary of State there, but no others. We have had the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs has come and a lot of other people. The next meeting will be in the United States, and probably we'll hold it in Washington, although a lot of the Canadians and Mexicans said, why don't you hold it in Pebble Beach or someplace nice like that? But probably Washington. It's gotten into a pattern where when it's Canada's turn, it's in Ottawa. When it's Mexico's turn, now it's in Mexico City. And that is so you have a greater chance of having some of the powers that be come and talk to you. And that is part to accomplish what you're talking about and let people see the advantages, what we have going for us that is important. I do think that it's important also it will be reassuring to people to say, look, we don't have in mind any big government here. The whole idea of governance of North America is to create the conditions where people do what comes naturally, and that can happen. Let it happen. Don't try to govern it or have somebody tell you what you're supposed to do.
I think this in part obviously depends on the attitudes of leaders and what they're confronting, and I just go back to something I maybe didn't emphasize enough at the very beginning of my introduction, which was in the early spring 1989 discussions down in the Situation Room about Brady bonds, where the Latin Americans wanted debt reduction, and our banks were adamant against it because they have to take write-downs, and the Treasury and the Fed weren't. The Treasury was kind of back and forth. We had the main negotiator, organizer, was in favor of this, but didn't want to lose all the banks. So we had the kind of same issues you guys dealt with as well. And President Bush just made it very clear, we want to do something for the region. Especially, we need to do something for Mexico to let them know they're our friend and partner. And that will help change attitudes in Mexico and be good for us. I mean, it was very clear, very explicit, that was the vision. And
Leadership matters. Boy, does leadership matter. That's one lesson I've learned tremendously.
Isn't there and I say this with all due respect to the U.S., which is a country I admire greatly, but I have the feeling, and usually it's shared by other foreigners, that the agenda in the State Department and in the government usually is some sort of adverse selection of issues. When there is complication and there is trouble, then it goes up in the agenda very quickly. And when things are working out and you have good neighbors, it goes naturally down in the agenda. So in Mexico, I do sense, and I don't know if the Canadians have the same feeling, that they take us for granted. and then when you see what sort of issues the U.S. government is tackling, and I understand the issues, and I understand how grave they are, but they don't have like another agenda that is with the proper selection. It's an adverse selection process here. And in Mexico, I don't know if Canada shares that feeling, that feeling that we could do much more with NAFTA and with the North American region. And what you are saying is true. The market is way beyond the authorities and the policymakers.
Yeah, don't let them know.
Isn't there a problem there in the way the foreign policy in this country is designed?
Well, I haven't been there for a long while, but I know when I was in office and I've talked to others, like Henry Kissinger, we've talked about it a lot. In the U.S., you have to start with the idea, we have to conduct a global diplomacy. We don't want to pivot here or pivot there. You've got to have an ability to be effective everywhere. And then within that framework, you have a strategy, and within that framework, I say, start with your neighborhood. That's where you live. You buy a house, you look at the house, but you also say, what's the neighborhood like? Are the schools any good around here? And so on. It's looking after your neighborhood is just common sense. And we should do it. I think there have been quite a few now meetings of the three heads of government. And I don't know whether that pattern is continuing, but I thought it was a good pattern. And I think our North America Forum meetings are a worthwhile effort, and we do attract people and get them to think about North America a little bit. Would you comment on the
I
forum?
think the North American Forum is a great idea, George, and I think your concept of not only thinking about ourselves as the United States, but thinking of ourselves as the North American region, and not thinking of ourselves as Canada, Mexico, and the United States, but the North American region. And for the reasons that you so well articulated about how to get things on the agenda and the separation of powers, I think that the reason that Michael got the answer at Trilateral was that people were uninformed. You know, there has been a movement to have a North American customs union. I've always opposed that. I think that's a step too far. I much prefer George's idea of the North American region, looking at our borders to be around. But if you begin to tell the respective governments how they should govern themselves, you're going to get a pushback. And I think that we could sell the Schultz idea, but you have to start somewhere, and that starts with business organizations, universities, think tanks, and the like, the North American Forum, and begin to tell people what are the advantages. Why do we want to do this? You know, and you mentioned guns, and you asked a question about guns. You know, it appalls me that we had legislated a ban on assault weapons going to Mexico that expired in 2004. Well, if it was a good idea in 2003, why don't we have it in 2013? This is crazy. And you know, that we couldn't educate people about this kind of issue. Nobody's really picked it up and tried to sell the notion of why it is we need to control this area. So I think it's an educational effort, and I have such admiration for what you've done in this sphere. Keep it up.
Well, actually, the World Affairs Council has been the Secretariat, and they have decided it's too much of a job, so we have decided at Hoover to take that job on.
Excellent.
We have to raise some money to do it and so on, but I think it can be a good thing for us. And also, personally, I think we should mount a kind of North America effort here, have a task force or something that develops ideas and keeps track and is a center of work and research on the subject.
I think
we'll see.
It's a natural, there's no doubt about that. I wanted to just make one quick point and then ask a question about demography, which you raised, which I think is important. One is derived from my many conversations with you on worrying about your neighborhood. One of the things about something that's successful is people tend to imitate it. So there is a SAFTA, South Asian Free Trade Agreement. It hasn't worked all that well. It's among the Pakistanis and Indians, Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans, Nepalese, Bhutan, the Maldives, etc. And so what's tended to happen is that the Indians have gone ahead and signed bilateral FTAs with Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. And the Pakistanis are left out in the cold. There's been very little tariff reduction, and there's a very large negative list. There's not a serious positive list. So Pakistan exports a lot more to Bangladesh, some of which undoubtedly goes back into India, than it does to nearby and vastly larger India, which is kind of nonsense. So George and Bill Perry have this group that tries to work on a track-to basis with Indians and Pakistanis. One of the points that this idea of your neighborhood drives home to me is if you draw a circle around India, it goes through virtually every tough place in the world. Yeah. You see this democracy in India, they have an immense stake in having people in those other societies have a stake in their success. So there's been a little bit of progress on some trade, slight trade openings, but hopefully that this idea, I think, is really central to unlocking one of the great difficulties in world affairs and
one of the things, Michael,
nuclear dangers.
We had the India Pakistanis here, retired generals and foreign ministers and people who still had influence, but weren't actually in the government. We were focusing more on nuclear things, but one of the things we suggested was that somebody should make a calculation of how much it is costing Pakistan not to have any reasonable amount of trade with India? How much could their GDP and income per capita increase? It's a large number. And I got word the other day that one of the people there had taken that up and had produced an estimate. So he wants to bring it here, and we should welcome
Great.
it.
It turns out a simple gravity model would predict Pakistan would export between 25 and 50 times as much to India as it does. So they're potentially huge. Now some of that's going through Doha and
When you
Dubai.
write your report, you should take note of the fact that the United States tariffs on products coming from the poorest countries in the world are enormously high. We charge Bangladesh 16 times more for their exports to us than we charge Great Britain. And in fact, they pay more for minuscule amount. I mean, I can send you the figures, and you go down through not only Bangladesh, but Pakistan, Indonesia, the largest Muslim countries in the world, pay multiples of what the Westerners, we still have Smoot-Hawley taxes on the products that they make.
I think that's a great point, and it follows a little bit along some of the issues Jaime was talking about data. A great project for all you graduate students up there. Somebody should be trying to produce, some of this exists in the WTO, a model of what the effective, you could tarify the quotas, what the effective tariffs are in all these relations. And that would indicate where the largest potential gains from trade would be. I think that would be something that would be very useful. Let me come back.
To put another thought to these students.
Yeah.
What are the benefits of having a North American, more of a thinking of us as a North American region, so that we, whether it's in trade, whether it's in energy, whether it's in a range of other, I'm going to talk about this a little while in the final session, but we've got to somehow or other get the attention of the leadership of the three countries to get them to take it as a priority that what they can do, in picking up your comment on leadership, George, how they can lead their countries in this thinking of a North American concept, so that that conveys to the business community, to the academic community, to the union community, whatever, that the world is bigger than each of our countries. And it's, if we can act in a concerted sort of way, there's going to be some very significant benefits that we're not achieving now.
Let me ask a demography question. So you have these charts on here not about Mexico, the US and Canada, but comparing Mexico to China as a developing country where the population is going to age rapidly, and Mexico will be as or older than America, as will China in a generation or so. So when I've discussed various reforms with the Chinese, I've continually made the case that you need to get rich before you get old. That as difficult as it is, we contemplate all the problems we have, which is now a big part of the battles going on the budget is doing something about future entitlement costs. We're worried about that in the US, but we're really rich. Okay, so it's a big problem here. It's a problem, as you're saying, about younger people having opportunities, the taxes they'll pay if we don't get this under control in the interim. But it's a lot easier to be rich and old than not so rich and old or poor and old. So it seems to me Mexico in particular should be thinking a lot about this kind of problem. Is there generalized strategic thinking about this in Mexico?
Yes. The government, first of all, we have some past problems that have accumulated, very delicate, because not all the institutions had pension funds properly designed. So the government is facing, even now that it's adjusting intelligently the public finances for the last 15 or 20 years, we're still facing serious problems with the financing of the old people. At the same time, we have, I think, so I'll talk about that in a minute, but when we have our discussion on the future of NAFTA, we have still some demographic capital to fix that. And we created I don't know if you're familiar, I'm sure that has been discussed in your group, but we have created for the last 15 or 20 years a forced saving mechanism for workers called Afores. and these are pension funds that are regulated by the financial by the financial law. And basically, we believe that by 2030, all those pension funds will be paying for the retired people. Now, this is not independent of what happens to the NAFTA demographics. Because the NAFTA demographics are, I was looking at your pyramids here. There's a great deal of complementarity between the demography in the US and Canada with the Mexican one. I see you have here 3 or 4 pyramids. And when you look at the one to the very right, which is the Nafta Pyramid, the implicit dependency ratio there is much lower than than the U.S. and Canada. And if you look at the dependency ratio applied to the young people in Mexico is very high. The dependency ratio applied to the old people is very low.
Right now.
Right now, yeah. So when you contemplate the 3 of them together, the dependency ratios become much more healthy. So that's why I think that the issue of migration and labor mobility becomes extremely relevant for the region. I'll show a couple of graphs that are not that different.
Okay, good. Anybody have one more question? We can. Okay, please, Brian.
I'd like to get your thoughts on one of seems to be the key constituents in all this, and that is the labor unions, and the inertia that is built up historically, resisting further integration. You mentioned teachers unions as a key impediment to educational reform. How do you see this all kind of evolving, as North America continues to integrate?
In the United States, the labor movement has changed dramatically. It used to be a private sector labor movement, but now it's, I think it's about half, or maybe more than half, public sector unionization. And their issues are different. If you're an auto worker, you worry about auto competition and so on. But the public sector unions don't have, there isn't a competition for the U.S. taxpayer dollar in the same sense. So I think the teachers union problem is not the same, and it's not really related to North America. It's just that if you think about the labor force in North America, then you have to worry about the quality of that labor force. And a lot of it stems from what we do about K through 12 education. And I've got a chart in here if anybody's interested. It plots different countries and their K through 12 and what their GDP is. It's a pretty convincing picture. There's a man named Eric Hanashek here at Hoover. He's quite an expert in the K through 12 area, and he's been working on this a lot.